The Battle of Coral Sea occurred when American troops tried to dislodge Japanese forces seeking to push their way deeper into Australia. Throughout this battle, both American and Japanese forces struggled with a new way of fighting. For the first time, enemy ships were forced to battle without seeing each other. On the morning of May 4th, 12 TBD torpedo planes and 28 SBD dive bombers leave the deck of the Yorktown at 0630 hours to dislodge the Japanese presence on Tulagi Beach. At 0815 hours, scout bombers dropped their first bombs, 1,000-pounders, on the gathered ships at Tulagi Harbor, sinking 2 small ships and forcing the destroyer Kikuzuki to be beached. 5 minutes later, at 0820 hours, the second American attack group storms in and sinks the sweeper Tamamaru. At 1100 hours on May 6th, a land-based search plane spots Admiral Fletcher's force and radios its position to the Japanese. The message is not received in time, costing the Japanese an opportunity to strike. Neither Fletcher nor Takagi were particularly proactive in seeking out the other's forces. At one point on the morning of 6 May, the two forces were within 70 miles of each other. For his part, Fletcher lacked the land-based search support needed to cover the wide area around his ships. Takagi, for unknown reasons, didn't send out any long-range search planes on either May 5th or 6th. Actually, Fletcher's force was truly ripe for attack on the afternoon of May 6th, when his ships were halted at a fueling rendezvous. If Japanese search planes had found Fletcher's task force in this vulnerable position, the battle for Coral Sea would have ended much differently. The next day, at 0736 hours, Japanese planes misidentify the American oiler Neosho and the destroyer Sims as a carrier and a cruiser, precipitating an all-out attack and costing the Japanese precious fuel and munitions. Within an hour, an American search plane makes a similar error, mistaking Japanese Admiral Marumo's group of relatively unimportant cruisers and gunboats as the Japanese strike force. Admiral Fletcher sends an attack group to destroy Marumo's ships. At 1200 hours, 3/4-ton bombs strike the Sims. 2 of them explode in the engine room and she begins to sink. The Sims explodes again just as she's disappearing below the surface, killing most of the men who abandoned her. There are only 16 survivors. The oiler Neosho meets a similar fate at 1202, with 7 direct hits and 8 near misses, turning her into smoking flotsam and killing over 400 men. At 1358, Admiral Crace's group survives an attack by no less than 45 planes. There are no hits and no casualties. At 1630, 27 Japanese attack planes, on their way back from an unsuccessful search for the Yorktown and Lexington, run into a group of American wildcats. 9 Japanese and 2 Americans are shot down. On the morning of May 8th, at 0822 hours, search planes from Zuikaku and Shokaku spot the Lexington and the Yorktown. The search planes lead the Japanese attack planes directly to the American ships. At 0838 hours, the Zuikaku and Shokaku are spotted by American search planes from the Lexington. Strike forces launch immediately. Foul weather was a friend of the Japanese on the 8th. Zuikaku and Shokaku were able to spend most of the battle in the protective cover of clouds and rain, while Fletcher's carriers were left in the open. At 10:57, the Shokaku becomes the first Japanese large carrier to undergo an American attack. 2 bombs from Yorktown's attack force damage the flight deck, and Shokaku can now recover planes, but not launch. At 11:18, Japanese torpedo bombers storm the Lexington. 2 torpedoes pierce her port side, while bombs destroy her smokestack and portside ammunition box, and several near misses rupture plates on her hull. The Yorktown fares little better, as an 800-pounder bores through her flight deck 15 feet inboard of the island and detonates on the 4th deck. 65 men die on the Yorktown, but her flight operations remain unaffected. At 11:40, a second wave of attackers from the Lexington strike Shokaku with 1 bomb, enough to eliminate her ability to recover planes. The Zuikaku must sacrifice some of her planes to make room for Shokaku's pilots to land. 108 Japanese are killed and 40 wounded during the 2 American bombing runs. At 12:47 hours, gasoline vapors building up in the Lexington's belly ignite. At 14:45 hours, a second explosion rocks the Lexington, destroying the ventilation system for the fire and engine rooms. Less than 6 hours later, at 2000 hours on the 8th of May, the U.S. destroyer Phelps torpedoes the Lexington, putting her 2,400 fathoms down. The Battle of Coral Sea is over. In the Battle of the Coral Sea, neither force did well for the amount of munitions expended. The Americans lost 1 carrier, 1 tanker, 1 destroyer, 66 planes, and 564 sailors and airmen, while the Japanese lost 1 small carrier, 1 destroyer, 77 aircraft, and 1,074 men, nearly double the personnel loss of the Americans. The Americans were able to thwart the Japanese main objective of advancing through Port Moresby into Australia. Both Japanese carriers remained out of commission for months, while the Yorktown was underway again shortly. A tactical toss-up, strategically this battle goes to the Americans.